Imagine putting on a Halloween mask, and it starts to change you. What would you do? This isn't just a spooky story. It's something that still haunts me today. Stay with me, because you won't believe what happened next. Welcome to the Horror Shack, where nightmares become reality. If you love being on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit the subscribe button, because we have even more terrifying stories coming your way. And while you're listening, comment below and let us know which parts scared you the most. I'm dying to know. Now, let's begin the story. I've always loved Halloween. There's just something about the season that makes everything feel a little more exciting. Growing up, it was always a big deal for my family. We'd go all out with decorations, costumes, even themed food. When I was a kid, we'd hold a massive party every Halloween, and it was the one time I was allowed to invite all my friends over. It was the highlight of my year. That all happened in my childhood home, an old Victorian house that had been in our family for generations. It's one of those houses that has character, creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and enough corners to lose yourself in. Despite its charm, there was always something a bit off about it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the house always felt heavy, like it was holding on to something. I never paid too much attention to it growing up, though. After all, it was just home to me. Now, as an adult, I hadn't been back to that house in years. My parents moved to Florida after retiring, and the place just sat empty for a while. I inherited it a few years ago, but never had the time or the desire to move in. That said, when Halloween was coming up last year, I had the bright idea to throw a party there, for old time's sake. It seemed like a great idea at the time, a way to relive the good memories. But something wasn't right about it this time. As I made plans, I couldn't shake the feeling that this party wasn't going to be like the ones from my childhood. There was a tension in the air I couldn't explain, and the more I prepared, the more uneasy I felt. I shrugged it off as nerves, though, just the stress of organizing everything. But now, looking back, I think I knew deep down that something was going to happen. I just didn't want to admit it to myself. A week before the party, I decided to head over to the house early to start decorating. I hadn't been there in months, so I wasn't sure what kind of shape it was in. As soon as I walked through the door, that strange feeling hit me again. The air inside was stale, heavier than I remembered, and the house seemed darker somehow, despite the sunlight pouring in through the windows. I figured it was just because the house had been closed up for so long. I went about my business, cleaning up and getting things ready, but when I headed up to the attic to find some of the old Halloween decorations we used as kids, that's when things took a turn. The attic had always creeped me out. It was cluttered with old furniture, dusty boxes, and relics from decades ago. Stuff my family never had the heart to throw away. But this time it felt different. I was rummaging through one of the old boxes when I found something I'd never seen before. It was an old, beat-up mask. The paint was chipped, the edges cracked, and the eye holes were completely hollow. It wasn't part of the Halloween decorations we usually used, and I had no memory of ever seeing it before. I remember the exact moment I touched it. There was this shift in the air. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but it's like everything around me went still for just a second, like the house was holding its breath. A cold chill shot through my spine, and I immediately pulled my hand back. For a minute, I thought about putting the mask back in the box and forgetting I ever found it. But there was something about it, something that made me feel like I wasn't supposed to leave it there. Against my better judgment, I kept it. I figured it would make for a good decoration, something spooky to hang on the wall during the party. I didn't know then that it would become the centerpiece of something far worse. A few days before the party, I went back to the house to finish decorating. I hung the mask on the living room wall, right above the fireplace. It was the kind of thing that was creepy enough to make people laugh nervously, but not so scary that it would send them running. Or at least, that's what I thought. Every time I glanced at it, though, I felt uneasy. There was something about the way the mask's hollow eyes seemed to follow me around the room that made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. It was just a mask after all. The night of the party finally came, and my friends arrived one by one. The house, which had felt so eerie and empty the past few days, was now alive with laughter, music, and chatter. People were dressed up in all sorts of costumes, and the atmosphere was lighthearted, exactly how I wanted it to be. For the first time since I started planning the party, I started to relax. We spent the first part of the night eating, drinking, and sharing ghost stories. Some of my friends had grown up in the same neighborhood, and they talked about the strange things that always seemed to happen around Halloween. One guy mentioned a series of disappearances from years ago, stories I vaguely remembered from when I was a kid, but never really thought too much about. We were all laughing, trading stories, and enjoying the spooky vibe when one of my friends, Tom, spotted the mask. He pointed it out to the group, saying how weird it looked, and before I could stop him, he took it off the wall and started passing it around. Everyone took turns holding the mask, making jokes about how creepy it was, but the whole time I was on edge. I didn't want to seem like the buzzkill who was too serious about a Halloween party, so I just laughed along with everyone else. But inside, I was hoping they'd put it back where it belonged. There was something about it that made me uneasy. Eventually, someone dared Tom to put the mask on. He hesitated at first, which was weird because Tom was usually the type to jump at a dare. But after some egging on from the group, he finally gave in. The second the mask touched his face, the room seemed to shift. The air felt colder, and the light from the candles flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. At first, we all laughed it off. I mean, it was a Halloween party. Stuff like this was supposed to happen, right? But then, Tom started acting different. He stood in the middle of the room, completely still, his head tilted slightly to the side. For a few moments, no one said anything. We all just stared at him, waiting for him to break character or crack a joke, but he didn't. The silence stretched on, and the longer it lasted, the more uncomfortable we all became. Finally, I stepped forward and asked him if he was okay. He didn't respond. He just kept standing there, staring at nothing, his breathing slow and shallow. One of the girls, Amy, reached out to touch his arm, and that's when he jerked away as if her touch burned him. The room went dead quiet. "Tom," I asked again, my voice shaking just a little. "Take off the mask, man. It's not funny anymore." He didn't move. It was like he couldn't hear me. The tension in the room was thick now, and I could see the unease spreading across everyone's faces. What started out as a fun, harmless prank was quickly turning into something else. Something none of us were prepared for. And then, without warning, Tom let out this low, guttural sound, a noise that didn't even seem human. It was like a growl, deep and rumbling, and it sent a shiver down my spine. He turned his head slowly to face me, and when I looked into the eye holes of the mask, I swear I saw something moving behind them. It wasn't Tom. Whatever was looking out from behind, that mask wasn't my friend. That's when the panic set in. I rushed forward and tried to pull the mask off his face, but it wouldn't budge. It was like it had fused to his skin. No matter how hard I tugged, it stayed put. And Tom, if that was even still Tom, just stood there, his body stiff and unyielding. "Help me!" I shouted to the others, but everyone just stood there, frozen in shock. No one knew what to do. Finally, one of the guys, Mike, stepped forward and grabbed Tom by the shoulders, trying to shake him out of whatever trance he was in. But the second Mike touched him, Tom, or whatever was controlling him, lashed out. He pushed Mike so hard that he flew backward, crashing into a table and knocking over drinks and decorations. That's when we all knew this wasn't just some Halloween prank gone wrong. Something was seriously, horribly wrong. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, scrambling to get away from Tom, but he just stood there in the middle of the room, completely still except for his breathing, which had become shallow and ragged. The only sound was the faint rustling of his breath through the mask. At that moment, all the lights in the house flickered out. For a few seconds after the lights went out, nobody moved. It was as if the darkness had frozen us in place. Then, slowly, someone fumbled for their phone, and a dim light filled the room as they turned on the flashlight. That's when we saw it. Tom was gone. There was no sound, no footsteps, nothing to explain how someone so solidly planted in the middle of the room could have just vanished. The front door was still locked. The windows were closed. It was like he had just disappeared into thin air. The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone was whispering, confused and panicked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Where is he?" someone asked, their voice trembling. No one had an answer. And then we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere beneath us. "The basement," I whispered. We used to call the basement the crypt when we were kids. It was dark, damp, and always had this weird smell like something was rotting down there. We never really spent much time in it, except when we were daring each other to go down there alone. It wasn't a place you wanted to be, and I had a sinking feeling that whatever was happening to Tom was only going to get worse if we didn't find him soon. Reluctantly, we all gathered at the top of the basement stairs. The flashlight beams danced along the walls, casting strange, flickering shadows on the cracked concrete. The air was heavy with dampness, and there was a low hum, like the house itself was breathing. "Tom," I called down, but there was no response, just the sound of those slow, methodical footsteps echoing back at us. We had no choice. We had to go down there. Step by step, we descended into the darkness, the flashlight beams barely cutting through the thick air. The further down we went, the colder it got, and the smell, God, the smell was overwhelming. It wasn't just musty old basement smell. It was something else, something foul and rotten, like the stench of decay. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, we saw him. Tom was standing in the middle of the basement, facing the far wall. The mask was still on his face, and his body was completely rigid, like a statue. The air around him felt wrong, thick and oppressive, like we weren't supposed to be there. I wanted to turn around and run, but I knew we had to get him out of there. "Tom," I said again, my voice barely a whisper. "Please, man, just take off the mask and come upstairs." But he didn't move. I stepped closer, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. That's when I saw it. There was something on the wall behind Tom, something I had never noticed before. It was a door, small and covered in cobwebs, like it had been sealed off for years. But now, it was slightly ajar, and from the darkness beyond it, there was a faint glow, like something was waiting just behind it. That's when Tom turned. It wasn't a slow turn. It wasn't the kind of turn you'd expect from someone half asleep or in a trance. It was sudden, sharp, and unnatural, like someone had yanked him around by invisible strings. The mask's hollow eye hole seemed to bore into me, and I could feel a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Tom's face, or what I could see of it, was pale, almost gray, like the life had been drained from him. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, I heard something else, a voice, but not his. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, but then it grew louder, filling the basement with a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "Leave," it said, the word echoing around the room. We all froze, our bodies locked in place by fear. My hand tightened around the flashlight, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. But there was no running now. Whatever was happening, we were in too deep. Suddenly, Tom lunged at me. He moved faster than I thought possible, his hands reaching out to grab me. I stumbled back, barely avoiding his grasp, and the others scattered, screaming as they ran for the stairs. I could hear the sound of footsteps, frantic and heavy, as my friends tried to escape, but I was frozen, locked in place by the sheer terror of what was happening. I had to get that mask off him. Without thinking, I lunged forward, grabbing Tom by the shoulders and trying to wrestle him to the ground. He was stronger than I expected, his body rigid and unyielding. But as I fought to pull the mask from his face, I felt something cold and wet, like slime, dripping from the edges of the mask. The mask wasn't just stuck to him, it was alive. The mask had fused to Tom's skin. My hands were slick with whatever was oozing from the edges, and the more I pulled, the more it seemed to sink deeper into his flesh, like it was becoming a part of him. His eyes, those hollow eye holes in the mask, stared straight through me, but I knew whatever I was looking at wasn't Tom anymore. Something else had taken over, and it wasn't going to let him go easily. I yelled for help, but the others were already halfway up the stairs, too terrified to come back. I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't been so close, I might have run too, but I was in too deep. I couldn't just leave him there, possessed by whatever this thing was. I needed to figure out what the hell was going on, and fast. That's when I remembered the old journal we'd found in the attic earlier. One of my friends had been flipping through it earlier in the night, laughing about the weird entries. It had stuff about rituals, old family legends, things none of us took seriously at the time. But now, in the dark, with Tom in front of me and the mask seemingly coming alive, it didn't seem so funny anymore. "Mike," I yelled up the stairs, "get the journal. Bring it down here." There was a moment of silence before I heard footsteps rushing back down. Mike appeared at the top of the stairs, flashlight in one hand, the journal in the other. He looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost, but he didn't hesitate as he handed me the book. I flipped through the fragile pages, my hands shaking as I skimmed the faded writing. The words were difficult to make out, the ink smudged and the paper brittle, but one passage caught my eye. It talked about the mask, an old family heirloom, passed down through generations. But it wasn't just a mask. According to the journal, it was part of some ancient ritual, something dark that had been used to summon something. I couldn't make out all the details, but one thing was clear. The mask wasn't meant to be worn. It was a conduit, a way for whatever was trapped inside it to cross over into our world. And Tom had just opened the door for it. I looked up from the journal, my heart racing. Tom was still standing there, rigid and unmoving, the mask firmly attached to his face. The glow from the door behind him seemed to be getting brighter, and the air around us felt thick with something unnatural. I had to act fast. The journal mentioned something about a way to stop the mask, something about reversing the ritual, sealing whatever was inside it before it could fully take hold. But the instructions were vague, and I had no idea if it would even work. Still, I had no other choice. If I didn't do something, Tom, and maybe the rest of us, would be lost. I quickly scanned the rest of the entry, trying to make sense of the instructions. It talked about needing items, things that could only be found in the house. A candle, a family heirloom, and a piece of parchment with a specific inscription. I remembered seeing a few of those things in the attic earlier when I found the mask. I shoved the journal into Mike's hands. "Stay here with Tom. I said, my voice trembling. "Don't let him move." Mike looked at me like I was crazy, but he nodded. I didn't have time to explain. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. I made it to the attic in record time, my heart pounding in my chest as I rummaged through the old boxes and piles of junk. I found the candle first, an old melted thing that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Next was the heirloom, a small locket that had belonged to my great-grandmother. And finally, tucked away in the corner of an old chest, I found the piece of parchment. The ink on it was faded, but the words were still legible, written in a language I didn't understand. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. I rushed back down to the basement, where Mike was still standing with Tom, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Tom hadn't moved, but the glow from the door behind him was getting brighter, and the air felt even heavier, like something was pressing down on us. "I've got everything," I said, breathless. "We need to do the ritual." Mike's eyes widened. "Do you even know how to do that?" I shook my head. "No, but the journal says this is the only way to stop it. We have to try." We moved quickly, lighting the candle and placing the locket in front of Tom. I held the parchment in one hand, my voice shaking as I tried to read the words written on it. The language was foreign to me, and the sounds felt strange coming out of my mouth, but as I spoke, the room seemed to shift. The glow from the door flickered, and the air around us began to stir. Tom let out a low groan, his body twitching as the mask seemed to tighten on his face. I kept reading, my voice growing stronger as the words flowed from my lips. The candle flickered wildly, and the shadows in the room seemed to swirl around us, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, as I reached the last word on the parchment, the mask began to crack. Tiny fissures appeared along the edges, and with a loud, shattering sound, it broke apart, pieces of it falling to the floor in a heap. The glow from the door faded, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. Tom collapsed to the ground, unconscious but breathing. The mask was gone. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there in the darkness, trying to process what had just happened. The air was still heavy, but it was different now, less oppressive, more normal. The basement was quiet, save for the sound of Tom's slow, steady breathing. I knelt down beside him, checking his pulse. He was alive, but he looked pale, drained. Whatever had taken hold of him was gone, but it had left its mark. "We did it," Mike whispered, his voice shaking. "We actually did it?" I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over yet. There was something about the way the air still felt thick, the way the shadows still seemed to cling to the walls. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I helped Mike carry Tom upstairs, laying him down on the couch in the living room. The party was long over by now. Most of the guests had left in a panic, but a few stayed behind, watching in shock as we explained what had happened. We sat there in silence for a while, too exhausted to speak, too shaken to move. But eventually, we gathered the pieces of the mask, the journal, and the other items from the ritual. I didn't want to leave them lying around, not after what had just happened. We packed everything away in the old box from the attic, sealing it shut and pushing it back into the farthest corner of the attic. Once everything was packed away, I locked the attic door. I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened was behind us now. But as I stood there in the dark hallway, staring at the locked door, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't just stopped something. We disturbed it. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We sat around in silence, barely speaking, just waiting for Tom to wake up. Eventually, he stirred, blinking groggily as he came to. He didn't remember much, just vague flashes of putting on the mask and then nothing, He kept asking what had happened, why everyone was so freaked out. We didn't have the heart to tell him everything, not right away. How could we explain what even we didn't fully understand? We left the house just after sunrise. No one wanted to stick around any longer than they had to. The house felt different now. Quieter, maybe, but not in a comforting way. It was like the air itself was watching us, waiting. As I locked the front door behind me, I promised myself I wouldn't come back anytime soon. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I tried to push it out of my mind, tried to focus on work, on my regular life, but the memories of that night kept creeping back in. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mask. I heard the whispers in the basement. I felt the weight of the house pressing down on me. One night, about a week after the party, I had a dream. In it, I was back in the attic, standing in front of the box where we had sealed away the mask and the other items. The attic was cold, darker than it should have been, and the air was thick with the same heaviness I had felt that night. In the dream, I reached out to open the box, but before I could touch it, I heard a voice, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Come back." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I told myself it was just a dream, just my mind playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. There was something unfinished about all of this, something I hadn't dealt with yet. The next day, I went back to the house. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. Maybe some kind of closure, maybe some explanation for what had happened. But when I stepped inside, everything was just as we had left it. The decorations from the party were still up, half fallen and covered in dust. The house was quiet still, but as I walked through the halls, I could feel it again, that heaviness, that weight pressing down on me. It was subtle, but it was there. I made my way upstairs to the attic and unlocked the door. The box was still in the corner, untouched, just as I had left it. I hesitated for a long time before I finally opened it. The mask was gone. I don't know what happened to it, and I don't know if I'll ever find out. I searched the attic, the entire house, but it was like the mask had just vanished. I haven't told my friends about it yet. They've moved on, and I don't want to drag them back into something that might be nothing. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever we did that night wasn't enough. It's been almost a year since the party, and Halloween is coming up again. I've thought about going back to the house, about trying to figure out what really happened that night. But part of me is scared of what I might find. There are too many questions left unanswered, too many things I don't understand. The mask, the voices, the door in the basement. It all feels connected, like pieces of a puzzle I'm not sure I want to solve. But I know one thing for sure. I can't ignore it forever. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that some things don't stay buried for long. The weeks leading up to Halloween passed slowly, each day dragging on, each night bringing with it more unsettling dreams. I tried to put the whole thing behind me, to tell myself that the mask was just a bizarre incident, something that couldn't be explained. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Not just the mask, but the way Tom's body had frozen, the way his eyes had gone empty, the door in the basement that led somewhere it shouldn't have. It was more than just a one-off. The house was keeping something, and I had a feeling that whatever it wasn't done with me yet. A few days before Halloween, I started getting calls from my friends, the ones who were at the party. Each of them seemed fine at first, asking how I was checking in, but then the conversation would turn to something darker. They didn't say it outright, but it was clear that they had been having nightmares too. Different dreams, but all with one thing in common: the mask. Amy, the girl who had touched Tom when he was wearing the mask, said she had seen it in her dreams. Not just seen it, but felt it. She said it was like it was calling to her, asking her to come back to the house, to finish what had been started. Mike, The one who had stayed with me in the basement while we performed the ritual admitted he'd been having strange visions too. He told me he hadn't slept a full night since the party. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the door in the basement swinging open, beckoning him inside. It was all too much to be a coincidence. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't want to do it alone. By the time Halloween night arrived, I had managed to convince a few of my friends to come back to the house with me. Amy, Mike, and two others, Sarah and Jason, agreed to meet me there. None of us wanted to, but we all felt the same pull. Like the house wasn't going to let us rest until we faced whatever was still inside. The drive to the house felt longer than usual. The streets were lined with kids trick-or-treating, their laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air, but it all felt distant, like I was moving through a fog. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than I'd like to admit. I didn't want to show up, but I knew deep down that we didn't have a choice. When I pulled up to the house, the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. The porch light wasn't on, even though I was sure I had left it on the last time I was here. The windows, too, were dark, almost like the house had drawn in on itself, as if it were trying to hide from the world. The others arrived shortly after me. No one said much. We didn't need to. The tension between us was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I don't like this," Amy whispered as we stood outside the front door. "I don't like this at all." "None of us do," Mike replied, his voice low. "But we have to see this through." With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The house was just as we had left it, except for one thing. The box in the attic, the one where we had locked away the mask and the other items, was now sitting in the middle of the living room. The sight of it sent a chill through my entire body. None of us had moved it. It shouldn't have been there. And yet, there it was, like it had been waiting for us. Jason was the first to speak. "What the hell is going on?" No one had an answer. I moved towards the box, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I had to. With shaking hands, I lifted the lid. Inside, the mask was back. It was just as I remembered, cracked, with chipped paint and hollow eye holes that seemed to stare straight through me. But there was something different about it this time. It looked newer, almost like it had been repaired, like whatever force was attached to it had given it new life. Amy stepped forward, her eyes wide. How did it get here?" "I don't know," I whispered, still staring at the mask. "But it's here, and I think it's waiting for us." We all stood there, frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The house felt alive around us, the walls seeming to pulse with energy, like the air itself was watching us. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and the sound of my own breathing seemed too loud, too harsh in the stillness. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "We need to get out of here." But before any of us could move, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then, with a loud crack, they went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there in the pitch black, the silence pressing in on us from all sides. I could feel the presence of the mask behind me, its hollow eyes burning into the back of my skull. Then, from the far corner of the room, we heard a noise, a slow, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. "Who's there?" Mike called out, his voice trembling. No answer, just the sound of something moving closer. Amy grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "We need to go, now." But I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my heart racing as the sound grew louder, closer. I could feel it in the air, the heaviness that had plagued the house for so long, growing stronger, more oppressive. Then, from the darkness, a voice. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it sent chills down my spine. "Come back." It was the same voice I had heard in my dream, the same voice that had been calling to me ever since that night. And now it was here, in the house, surrounding us. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The weak beam of light barely cut through the darkness, but it was enough to see what was in the room with us. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even something I could fully describe. It was a shadow, a figure standing in the corner, its body twisting and writhing like smoke. And in its hand, it held the mask. It raised the mask slowly, as if offering it to us. "Take it," the voice whispered. "Finish what you started." No one moved. We were all frozen, locked in place by fear. The shadow didn't move either, just stood there, holding the mask out towards us. Finally, I found my voice. "What do you want?" The shadow shifted, the air around it shimmering with a strange, unnatural light. The mask seemed to pulse in its hand, and the voice came again, louder this time. "Come back." We had a choice. We could take the mask, finish whatever had been started, or we could leave. But something told me that if we left, the house wouldn't let us go that easily. Whatever was tied to the mask, whatever was waiting for us in the shadows, wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. I glanced at my friends. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. I knew what I had to do, but the weight of the decision pressed down on me like a physical force. Slowly, I reached out, my hand trembling as I moved towards the mask. My fingers brushed the edge of the mask, and immediately I felt a cold shock race through my hand, up my arm, and into my chest. It was like the mask was alive, pulsing with some dark energy that seemed to wrap itself around me, pulling me in. I could hear my friends behind me, whispering for me to stop, to let go, but I couldn't. It was as if my body was moving on its own, compelled by something stronger than fear. I gripped the mask fully, and in that moment, the room seemed to tilt, like the ground beneath me wasn't stable anymore. The shadows in the room swirled, growing thicker, darker, until they closed in around me. I could barely make out my friends' faces in the dim light, but I could hear them calling my name, their voices muffled and distant, like I was underwater. The shadowy figure in the corner began to fade, melting into the darkness, leaving me alone with the mask. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, and the weight of the house, of whatever was trapped inside it, pressed down on me. The mask pulsed in my hands, the hollow eye holes staring back at me. I could feel it pulling me, urging me to put it on. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to stop, to throw the mask away and run, but I couldn't. Something was keeping me there, something stronger than my will. I lifted the mask slowly, feeling the cold, cracked surface against my skin. As soon as it touched my face, everything went black. I wasn't in the house anymore. I found myself standing in a dark, cold room, the walls made of rough stone, lit only by the faint glow of a single candle. The air was thick with the smell of earth and dampness, and the shadows seemed to stretch out forever. In the center of the room stood a figure, hunched over, its back to me. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move. It was like it didn't even know I was there, or maybe it didn't care. As I got closer, I could see that it was wearing the mask, the same mask I had just put on. But this wasn't the old, cracked version I had found in the attic. This one was new, its paint fresh, its eye holes filled with a dull, glowing light. The figure turned slowly, and when I saw its face, my face, staring back at me, I stumbled backward, nearly falling to the ground. It was me. Or at least it was some version of me, twisted and distorted by the mask. The figure stepped closer, its eyes locked on mine, and as it did, I felt a deep, overwhelming fear take hold of me. This wasn't just some trick of the mind, some nightmare I could wake up from. This was real. I've been waiting, the figure said, its voice my voice but twisted, warped. Waiting for you to come back. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stand there, frozen in place, as the figure reached out, placing its hand on my chest. The touch was cold, so cold it burned, and I gasped as pain shot through me. You opened the door, it whispered, and now you must pay the price. The figure leaned in close, its breath freezing against my skin. You can't escape this. You never could. The weight of those words pressed down on me, and in that moment, I knew what it wanted. The mask, the house, the strange occurrences, it had all been leading to this. It wasn't just about the mask itself. It was about the spirit tied to it. Something ancient, something vengeful, something that needed a host. And it had chosen me. I fought to break free, to pull the mask off, but my hands wouldn't move. My body was no longer my own. I could feel the mask tightening against my skin, fusing to my face, just like it had with Tom. I could feel the presence inside it, the spirit merging with me, taking control. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness was closing in around me, swallowing me whole. And then, just as the last bit of light faded, I heard a voice. Not the twisted voice of the figure, but Amy's voice, distant but clear. Don't let it take you. It was enough to break the hold just for a moment. With all the strength I had left, I ripped the mask from my face, throwing it to the ground. The instant it left my skin, the vision shattered, and I was back in the house, gasping for air. I was on the floor of the living room, the mask lying a few feet away from me, cracked and lifeless. My friends were gathered around me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. What the hell just happened? Jason asked, his voice shaky. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the mask was still dangerous, still holding on to something dark. It hadn't gotten what it wanted, but it wasn't finished yet. We need to get rid of it, I whispered, my voice hoarse. For good this time. We didn't waste any time. We gathered the mask, the journal, and the other relics from the house and took them outside. I didn't care about rituals or curses anymore. I just wanted to be done with it. We built a fire in the backyard, and one by one, we threw the items into the flames. The mask was the last to go. As it burned, I could almost hear a faint scream, like the spirit trapped inside was finally being released. But whether it was just my imagination or something more, I'll never know. We watched in silence as the fire consumed everything, the flames flickering in the cool night air. When it was over, we left the house and never looked back. It's been a year since that night, and I still think about it sometimes. I still dream about the mask, about the house, about what could have happened if we hadn't stopped it. But we did stop it, and that's what matters. I haven't been back to the house since. It still belongs to me, but I've let it sit empty. It's not the kind of place anyone should live, not after what happened. Maybe someday I'll sell it, or maybe it will just stay there, rotting away like the memories of that night. One thing's for sure though, I'll never forget the lesson I learned. Some things are better left buried. Some doors should never be opened. And some masks should never be worn. As the story fades out, the music shifts to a soft, haunting melody. So, that's the end of tonight's story. But remember, some masks, once worn, never really come off. Sleep well. If you can, pause for a chilling moment of silence. And before you drift off, don't forget to subscribe to the Horror Shack. We've got even more stories that will keep you up at night, and I don't want you to miss them. I'll leave these sounds playing to help you drift into whatever dreams may come. Good night.